The lights were blinding. The cameras were rolling. And for a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. It was the most watched broadcast of the year. Voices of the World. A high-profile international roundtable featuring politicians, thinkers, veterans, and journalists from across the globe. But let's be honest, people weren't tuning in for the panel. They were tuning in for two names. Caroline Leavitt, a rising star in American politics, young, bold, sharp-tongued, and opposite her, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the revolutionary leader from Burkina Faso, a man known for his stoic calm, his fire-tested leadership, and his refusal to bow. Two worlds, two ideologies, one stage. At first, the energy was formal, respectful, civil, but everyone could feel it building like a storm just off the coast. And then it happened. A question from the moderator, seemingly innocent. What role should the West play in Africa's future? Caroline sat up straighter. Her smile, a little too wide. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass. She gave a light chuckle that didn't reach her eyes and leaned into the microphone. "Why are we even pretending?" she said, condescendingly. "Captain Traoré, your so-called anti-imperialism isn't leadership. It's toxic pride. You're biting the hand that feeds you." There it was. The first jab. The camera cut to Captain Traoré. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. His face remained still like carved stone. But the tension in the studio, it shifted. And then, it happened. Caroline leaned forward just a little more. Her tone dipped. Her voice sharpened. And she said on live global television, "You know what? Go back to Africa. You in great time." Stopped. The audience gasped. The moderator froze. Somewhere, a child watching from home dropped his cereal spoon. One of the cameramen accidentally bumped his zoom button, and the lens pushed in tight on Captain Traoré's face. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But something ancient passed behind his eyes. Like a storm he'd weathered before. The studio held its breath. Social media exploded within seconds. Hashtags were flying. Clips were already circulating. But on that stage, there was silence. All eyes turned to him. Would he strike back? Would he call her out? Would he match her venom? No. He simply leaned forward, calmly, gently, and said, "Let me tell you a story." You could hear the tension snap. Even the camera crew paused. Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouthed, "Keep it rolling." Caroline smirked like she'd won something, like she'd landed the knockout blow. But she didn't realize she had just triggered something far bigger than herself. Because Traoré didn't raise his voice. He raised a mirror. Across the world, people leaned in. In a small apartment in Detroit, an 11-year-old boy named Malik sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide. In Nairobi, a college student put down her pen. In Atlanta, a grandmother turned up the volume. Everyone felt it, the shift. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was something deeper. Back on set, the moderator looked stunned, unsure whether to intervene. But the weight in the room had changed. Caroline folded her arms and tried to hide her discomfort. But it was too late. The story had begun. And when Traoré spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with something far more powerful: clarity. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He didn't retaliate. Instead, he told the truth. And it was devastating. That's where we end. Part 1. Not because the moment was over, but because the world had just begun to listen. And what came next would change everything. He didn't ask for silence, but somehow, he commanded it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré leaned into the microphone, not with fury, not with pride, but with something deeper, something weightier, like grief that had learned to speak. In 1987, he began softly. My country lost a man named Thomas Sankara. The room held still. He dreamed of a free Africa, one that stood with dignity, not dependence. They didn't just kill him. They tried to kill what he believed in. Caroline rolled her eyes. But no one else moved. My father, he continued, worked in the gold mines. He came home one night, covered in blood, not his own. He had saved a foreign worker from collapsing in the heat. And do you know what they did? They fired him. His voice didn't tremble, but the weight of his words was like steel, sharp, heavy, and cold. Across the world, people leaned closer to their screens. In a school in South Carolina, a Black history teacher paused her lesson. In Burkina Faso, an old man whispered, "He's telling the truth." And in Detroit, that little boy Malik, he was still sitting cross-legged on the floor, his eyes wide. His mother stood behind him now, hand over her mouth. She had told him bedtime stories about home, but never like this. Captain Traoré wasn't reading notes. He wasn't reciting policy. He was remembering. I'm not here to beg, he said. I'm not here to ask for pity. I'm here to remind you that we never invited colonizers. We never asked to be enslaved. But we survived. And we survived with dignity. Silence. One of the camera operators blinked back tears. A woman in the third row reached for her husband's hand. Caroline was shifting in her seat now. The fire in her earlier tone had dimmed. Just slightly. And then came the moment that cracked something open. You called me ungrateful, he said, turning to her calmly. But let me tell you why I speak. He paused, breathed, then looked straight into the camera. His name was Adama. He said, my best friend. We were both 12. One day, a mining truck owned by a foreign company struck him. He was carrying water for his family. They didn't stop. They didn't help. They didn't pay. They just drove away. A tremor passed through his voice just for a second. We buried him in a cotton bag. No coffin. No grave marker. Just dirt and prayers. The air in the studio changed. The lights were still bright, but the room had gone cold. In Georgia, a mother dropped her spatula and cried over her kitchen sink. In North Carolina, a retired soldier whispered, Dear God, even on Capitol Hill. Staffers were texting each other. Are you watching this? This wasn't politics. This was a eulogy. So when I speak, he said, I don't do it out of anger. I speak for children buried with no name, for farmers who never saw justice. For Adama, he let the silence settle. A sob echoed from the back of the studio. No one knew who it came from, but no one questioned it. And then out of nowhere, Caroline tried to jump back in. Okay. But are you saying America has no right to criticize? She snapped. Her voice high. Her tone defensive. Traoré didn't even blink. He looked straight at her and said softly, but with the weight of centuries, No. I'm saying you should look in the mirror before speaking into a microphone. Boom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the moderator shifted awkwardly in his seat. That line hit like thunder not because it was loud, but because it was true. Back in Detroit, little Malik whispered, "That's my hero." And across the internet, hashtags exploded. Number Ibrahim Traore, number Adama, number look in the mirror. The man Caroline called an ingrate was now reminding the world of something they had buried. Something too painful, too inconvenient, but no longer ignorable. And just like that, the tide was turning. Captain Ibrahim Traore hadn't raised his voice. But somehow, without anger, without insult, he had raised the conscience of a nation. Caroline Leavitt was known for her sharp tongue. She'd silenced talk show hosts, dismantled press briefings, and turned hearings into highlight reels. But now, she was quiet. Captain Ibrahim Traore hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't even moved. But somehow he was winning. Not with force. With something far more disarming. Truth. The moderator tried to reset the tone. But it was too late. The room belonged to him now. Caroline leaned back in her chair. Arms crossed. Fingers twitching. She wore the look of someone trying to hold on to a script that no longer fit the story. And Traore, he leaned in again. Calm. Focused. My first uniform, he said, was not given to me by an army. My mother stitched it from old cloth scraps. I wore it to protect my village from gangs that came at night to steal our food. You could hear chairs creak in the audience as people leaned in without realizing. We didn't have rifles. We had sticks. But we stood between our families and fear. He paused. His gaze dropped for a moment, as if remembering something painful, but then lifted again. Clear as glass. One day, he said, an American officer visited our training ground. He laughed when he saw us. He said, "You people play soldier with sticks." The audience flinched. Even Caroline blinked. That night, I stood on a hill, barefoot, watching my village sleep. I didn't pray for weapons. I prayed for respect. In Houston, a veteran stood from his chair. In a New York classroom, a young girl whispered, "He sounds like my dad." And back in Burkina Faso, an old woman pressed her trembling hand to the television screen. It was his mother. She remembered that night. The night he came home from patrol with cracked feet and a brave smile. He didn't ask for help. She whispered. He became the help. Meanwhile, in the studio, Caroline was growing visibly uncomfortable. Not because she was under attack, but because she wasn't. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a reckoning. She leaned forward. Finally, her voice low but tight. "So what do you want?" "Captain," she asked, half sarcastic. "A medal." There was a pause. Then Traore looked up. Eyes steady. "No, madam," he said. "I want my people to eat." Boom. The words hit the studio like a siren in the silence. The audience gasped. Even the moderator stopped breathing for a second. And then he reached into his jacket pocket. Slowly, silently, and unfolded a photo. The camera zoomed in. It was faded, creased. A little boy, barefoot, kneeling beside a goat, smiling, wide-eyed, full of innocence. "This is me," Traore said. "I was 7. Caroline snorted quietly. But before she could speak, Traore cut through. I am not ashamed of where I come from. I am ashamed only that children still go hungry, while your corporations steal our gold. Silence. The kind that feels like it cracked the floor beneath your feet. Backstage. A producer dropped his headset. The sound technician whispered, "Did he just say that on live television?" Yes. He did. And no one moved to cut him off. Across America, living rooms fell quiet. In Seattle, a mother watching with her teenage daughter wiped a tear before it fell. In Mississippi, a retired teacher whispered, "This man ain't here to debate. He's here to testify." Caroline looked down, her jaw tense. She hadn't expected this. She'd come in ready for a fight. But this wasn't a fight. This was a man unraveling pain, so old and so honest. No rebuttal could contain it. And just when people thought it couldn't get more real, Traoré reached into his pocket again. But this time, he didn't pull out statistics. He didn't cite reports. He placed something on the table. Softly. A pair of tiny, frayed sandals. Worn. Dusty. Torn at the straps. "These," he said, "belonged to my cousin Mayam. She was 6. He took a breath. One morning, she stepped on a shattered medicine bottle outside a foreign clinic. She bled for 2 hours. We had no car. No doctor. We buried her in these," gasps, hands over mouths. A camera in the audience caught a grown man sobbing into his palms. "So when I speak of injustice," Traoré said, "I don't speak in theory. I speak from graves. From barefoot children buried in silence." Even Caroline didn't speak. Because how do you argue with that? And somewhere in the control room, a voice finally whispered, "We're not airing a debate anymore. We're airing history." Somewhere between the sandals and the silence, Caroline Levitt stopped being the most powerful voice in the room. For the first time in her career, she wasn't winning the moment she was witnessing it. Captain Ibrahim Traoré hadn't thrown accusations. He hadn't humiliated her with anger or outrage. But the things he laid on the table, a worn photo, a broken pair of sandals, a boy's name buried in a cotton bag, they weren't props. They were proof. And proof has a way of bending even the sharpest pride. The lights on the stage hadn't changed, but Caroline's face had. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone was the smug edge. In its place, a slow, indéniable tremor. Not in her voice, but in her eyes. Backstage, a journalist named Malik. Yes. That Malik? The 11-year-old boy from Detroit, who had once dropped his cereal spoon, now grown. Now, a reporter was watching the live feed from a press monitor. And something about Caroline's tone. It felt familiar. He started digging. Public records. Old speeches. College archives. Until he found it. A grainy video clip. A much younger Caroline. Standing in front of a university auditorium. Bright-eyed. Passionate. Human. And there it was, clear as day. "Africa deserves dignity," she had said into a microphone. "The West has failed to listen. We must do better." Malik stared at the screen. Stunned. What happened to her? Back in the studio, Caroline was quiet again. Traoré had stopped speaking. But his words hadn't stopped echoing. The moderator tried to recover, offering her space to respond. She leaned forward, her voice straining to sound steady. "You act like you're the only one who suffered," she said. My grandfather came here with nothing too. Traoré didn't challenge her. He didn't scoff or roll his eyes. Instead, he surprised her. Tell me his name, he asked. Gently. She blinked. What, your grandfather? Tell me his name. The room went silent again. Caroline opened her mouth, then hesitated, then faltered. Her fingers moved unconsciously toward her purse. She pulled out a small, worn photo, one she never showed. His name was Elias. Traoré nodded. Then we are not so different. A pause. But the difference is I would never tell you to go back to where you came from. And that was it. That was the moment everything shifted. Not just in the room, but in her. Her posture changed. Her walls cracked. And suddenly, Caroline wasn't the antagonist anymore. She was a person. She reached back into her purse, almost like muscle memory, and pulled out something even older than the photo. A thin, woven bracelet made of straw. Faded, delicate, tied in a simple loop. She held it up, and for the first time that night, her voice shook. He gave me this, she said quietly. Gibril. The studio tilted with recognition. He was an exchange student from Mali. We were classmates in college. He cried during a presentation, once talking about child labor in the gold mines. I hugged him. I told him I'd remember his story. She looked down at the bracelet. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But I forgot. Across the country, people were now weeping openly. In California, a mother watching with her teenage daughter whispered, "She's breaking. Baby, she's breaking open." In Ghana, a high school teacher paused the live stream and said, "This is what healing looks like." And in the control room, the director gave a single, hushed order: don't cut. Let it breathe. Caroline's eyes had turned glassy. Her voice barely audible. You reminded me, she said to Traoré, of something I buried. You didn't attack me. You held up a mirror. Traoré didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just nodded. We don't win with anger, he said. We win with truth. The bracelet hung from Caroline's fingers like a thread pulling her back to herself. A reminder that once she had known better, and now she was remembering. By now, no one in the studio was pretending this was just another debate. The clock said the show should have ended 40 minutes ago. But no one moved. Not the cameras. Not the audience. Not even Caroline. Because what was unfolding wasn't politics anymore. It was something sacred. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat still, hands folded. Then, slowly, almost reverently, he reached into his jacket one final time. The room held its breath. This time, it wasn't a photo, or a pair of sandals, or a memory wrapped in silence. It was a letter. Old, worn, folded so many times the edges had curled. I wrote this when I was 15, he said softly. To the president of Burkina Faso. I never sent it. I didn't think anyone would care. He unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded, the paper torn at the corners, but his voice, steady as ever. Dear President, he began. Please tell the world we are not weak. We just don't have shoes. We are not poor. We just don't get paid. We are not angry. We are tired. A tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the front row. No music, no dramatics, just truth. and it hit like thunder. I didn't write this for applause, he said, just for anyone to listen. And somehow, tonight, the whole world was. Backstage, Caroline was watching through the side monitor. She was no longer preparing comebacks, no longer posturing. She was listening, and suddenly, she wasn't seeing an opponent. She was seeing a man, one who walked barefoot to school, one who wore a stitched uniform to protect his people, one who buried a cousin in sandals and a friend in a cotton sack. And still he stood here, not broken, not bitter, just real. That night, Caroline posted a video. No makeup, no production crew, no advisors, just her, a dim office, and a voice almost too soft to recognize. Captain Treasury taught me something nobody ever could. She said, I'm sorry. To him, to Africa, and to the girl I used to be. The clip went viral in under 12 hours. Not because it was perfectly polished, but because it was honest. And at the end, she said, I'm not here to save the world, but I'm here to listen now. And people didn't cheer. They cried. Because real change doesn't shout. It whispers. 3 days later, Traoré flew home to Burkina Faso. The airport was quiet. No red carpets. No parade. But on the dirt road, just outside the terminal, a small girl was waiting. Dust on her shoes. A handwritten letter in her hand. She didn't speak English. She just smiled and handed it to him. Later that day, under a mango tree, where he used to play as a boy, he opened it. Crayon handwriting. Simple words. Thank you for speaking for my daddy. He worked in a mine. He died, but I saw you on television. I'm not afraid anymore. He folded the letter gently, pressed it to his chest, and looked up at the sky. That's why I spoke, he whispered. That night, he gave one last interview. The host, holding back tears, asked Captain, what message do you have for the world? Traoré looked into the camera. Calm, unshaken, but deeper now, like a mountain that had finally spoken. May we never forget the humanity in each other. And around the world, people didn't. In classrooms, living rooms, buses, prisons, Capitol buildings, gold mines. People remembered. Not the politics, not the insults, not the viral clip, but the sandals, the bracelet, the voice, and the letter that was never mailed, but somehow reached everyone